The small town of Harmony Creek, Ohio, was usually a place of quiet evenings and friendly waves across Main Street. But the peace was shattered when Sarah Jenkins, a 23-year-old kindergarten teacher with a smile as bright as the summer sun, vanished without a trace. One morning, she simply didn't show up for work. Her students, usually eager for story time, were confused and disappointed. Her colleagues were immediately concerned. Sarah was never late, and she always called if she was going to be absent. Her parents, Carol and Tom, were frantic. They called everyone they knew, but no one had seen or heard from Sarah since the previous evening. Sarah's boyfriend, David, a seemingly ordinary accountant with a neatly trimmed beard and kind eyes, told them that Sarah had been feeling restless. He said she'd talked about needing a change, a fresh start. He claimed she'd packed a bag and left a note saying she needed time to herself, implying she'd run away. The local police, initially hesitant to jump to conclusions, started a missing person investigation. Sheriff Brody, a man known for his calm demeanor and thorough approach, organized search parties. Volunteers combed the nearby woods, fields, and riverbanks, their hopes dwindling with each passing day. Flyers with Sarah's smiling face were plastered on every lamppost and storefront. The community rallied together, organizing fundraisers to support the search efforts and offering words of comfort to Sarah's grieving parents. But something felt off. Sarah's friends insisted she would never just leave without telling anyone where she was going. Her parents couldn't believe she would abandon her beloved students. And Sheriff Brody couldn't shake the feeling that David wasn't telling the whole truth. His story seemed rehearsed, too perfect. Small inconsistencies began to emerge, little cracks in the facade of a grieving boyfriend. The note Sarah supposedly left was typed, not handwritten, which was unusual for her. And some of her personal belongings, like her favorite hiking boots, were still at home. The investigation was about to take a dark turn, one that would reveal a chilling pattern of deception and violence. As the days turned into weeks, the initial flurry of activity surrounding Sarah's disappearance began to wane. The search parties became smaller, the flyers faded in the sun, and the hope of finding Sarah alive slowly diminished. But Sheriff Brody remained determined. He couldn't shake the feeling that David was hiding something. He decided to focus his attention on the boyfriend, meticulously reviewing David's statement, cross-referencing his alibi, and subtly increasing the pressure during their interviews. David, initially calm and composed, started to show signs of unease. He became more defensive, his answers less fluid. He started avoiding eye contact and fidgeting during questioning. Sheriff Brody noticed these subtle changes, each one reinforcing his suspicion. He decided to bring in Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp intuition and ability to read people. Detective Miller joined the investigation, bringing a fresh perspective. She reviewed the case files, focusing on the inconsistencies in David's story and the lack of concrete evidence supporting his claim that Sarah had run away. She suggested a more thorough search of David's house, focusing on areas that might have been overlooked previously. During the second search of David's home, the forensic team meticulously examined every room. They dusted for fingerprints, collected hair samples, and searched for any signs of a struggle. It was in the laundry room, tucked away in the back of the house, that they found something that would change the course of the investigation. A single, long blonde hair, clinging to the lint trap of the dryer. It seemed insignificant at first, just another piece of lint among many. But Detective Miller had a hunch. She carefully collected the hair, placing it in a sterile evidence bag. Little did she know, that single strand of hair held the key to unlocking a dark secret, a secret that would unravel David's carefully constructed lie and expose a chilling pattern of violence that stretched across state lines. The hair was sent to the state crime lab for DNA analysis, and everyone waited with bated breath for the results, unaware of the shocking revelation that was about to unfold. David, on the surface, appeared to be the picture of a supportive and grieving boyfriend. He answered every question politely, offered to help with the search, and even provided Sheriff Brody with a timeline of his and Sarah's activities leading up to her disappearance. He described their last evening together, a quiet dinner at home, watching a movie, and then Sarah confiding in him about her desire for a change. He portrayed her as someone who was struggling with her life in Harmony Creek, someone who felt stifled and needed to break free. He recounted the note she had supposedly left, a short, typed message expressing her need for space and time to figure things out. He claimed he found it on the kitchen counter the morning she disappeared, along with her car keys and wallet, further suggesting she had left intentionally. He even shed a few tears during the interviews, portraying himself as a victim of Sarah's sudden and unexpected departure. But beneath the surface of his carefully constructed narrative, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. He couldn't recall specific details about the movie they had watched, his timeline shifted slightly with each retelling, and he seemed overly eager to emphasize Sarah's unhappiness. Detective Miller, with her keen eye for detail, noticed that David never referred to Sarah in the present tense. He always spoke of her in the past, as if she were already gone. Furthermore, David's description of Sarah's state of mind didn't quite align with what her friends and family knew to be true. They described her as a happy and outgoing person, someone who loved her job and cherished her relationships. They couldn't imagine her leaving without saying goodbye, especially to her students. These discrepancies, coupled with David's increasingly nervous demeanor, fueled the detective's suspicions and solidified their belief that he was hiding something sinister. The wait for the DNA results from the hair found in the dryer became even more agonizing, as they knew it could be the key to unlocking the truth and exposing David's lies. The initial days of the investigation were a race against time. Sheriff Brody treated Sarah's disappearance as a missing person case, hoping she would be found safe and sound. They interviewed her friends, family, and colleagues, searching for any clues that might lead to her whereabouts. They checked local bus and train stations, airports, and even hospitals, but there was no sign of Sarah. The lack of leads was frustrating, and the pressure from the community was mounting. The search was hampered by the fact that there was no clear crime scene. Sarah's house showed no signs of forced entry or a struggle. Her car was still parked in the driveway, and her personal belongings were undisturbed. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The only piece of evidence that suggested she had left willingly was the typed note, but even that felt staged and unnatural. As the days passed, and the search efforts yielded no results, Sheriff Brody began to consider the possibility that Sarah had met with foul play. The focus shifted to David, whose inconsistent story and nervous demeanor made him the prime suspect. They started digging deeper into his background, searching for any red flags or past incidents that might shed light on his character. They reviewed his financial records, his phone logs, and his social media activity, looking for any connections to Sarah's disappearance. The detectives also canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing David and Sarah's neighbors, hoping to find someone who had seen or heard something unusual. Some neighbors reported hearing a heated argument coming from David's house a few nights before Sarah disappeared, but no one had called the police. Others described David as a quiet and reserved man, but also somewhat controlling and possessive of Sarah. These accounts further fueled the detective's suspicions and strengthened their resolve to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or disturbing it might be. The DNA results from the hair in the dryer were now more crucial than ever, as they could provide the concrete evidence needed to break David's alibi and bring him to justice. In the sterile environment of the state crime lab, the single blonde hair found in David's dryer sat innocuously in its evidence bag. To the untrained eye, it was just another piece of debris, easily dismissed as insignificant. Even the forensic technician who initially processed the evidence didn't think much of it. Hairs and fibers are common finds in most homes, especially in laundry rooms. But Detective Miller's intuition told her otherwise. She had seen too many cases where seemingly minor details turned out to be the key to solving a crime. The hair itself was unremarkable, about 12 inches long, a pale, almost platinum blonde, and slightly damaged at the ends, as if from heat styling. It didn't match Sarah's hair, which was a darker, honey blonde shade. This raised even more questions. If it wasn't Sarah's hair, whose was it? Had David had another woman in his house? Or was there a more sinister explanation? Detective Miller pressed the lab to expedite the DNA analysis. She knew that time was of the essence, and every day that passed without finding Sarah was a day closer to losing her forever. The lab technicians extracted DNA from the hair follicle and began the process of comparing it to known DNA profiles in the national database. It was a tedious and time-consuming process, but it was their best hope of identifying the hair's owner and potentially uncovering a connection to Sarah's disappearance. Days turned into nights as the detectives waited anxiously for the results. The tension in the Harmony Creek Sheriff's Department was palpable. Everyone knew that the DNA analysis could either confirm their suspicions about David or lead them down a completely different path. Finally, the call came. The lab technician on the other end of the line sounded grave. "Detective Miller," he said, "we have a match." The words hung in the air, heavy with anticipation. The lie was about to unravel, and the truth, no matter how horrific, was about to be revealed. The process of DNA analysis is a complex one, involving the extraction of genetic material from a sample, amplification of specific DNA regions, and comparison of the resulting profile to known DNA sequences. In this case, the lab technicians extracted a tiny amount of DNA from the root of the blonde hair. They then used a technique called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, to make millions of copies of specific DNA markers, creating a profile unique to that individual. This profile was then run through the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, a national database containing DNA profiles of convicted offenders, arrestees, and missing persons. The initial search yielded no results. The hair didn't match any known offenders in Ohio or any individuals associated with Sarah. But Detective Miller urged the lab to broaden the search, to cast a wider net across the entire national database. It was a long shot, but she was desperate for answers. Then, the impossible happened. A hit. The DNA profile from the blonde hair matched that of Emily Carter, a 25-year-old woman who had vanished from Boulder, Colorado, 2 years prior. Emily had been reported missing by her parents after she failed to show up for work one morning. Her car was found abandoned near a hiking trail, and the investigation had gone cold, despite extensive search efforts. The news sent shockwaves through the Harmony Creek Sheriff's Department. What was the connection between Sarah Jenkins, missing from Ohio, and Emily Carter, missing from Colorado? And more importantly, what was David's connection to either of them? The revelation was both stunning and terrifying. It suggested that Sarah's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger, more sinister pattern. David's carefully constructed lie was crumbling, and the detectives were about to confront him with the devastating truth. He had insisted Sarah ran away. But the DNA said otherwise. He'd done it before. Sheriff Brody and Detective Miller found David at his accounting office, his face pale and drawn. They asked him to come down to the station for further questioning, informing him that they had new information regarding Sarah's disappearance. He complied, his initial composure masking a growing sense of dread. In the interrogation room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Sheriff Brody laid out the facts, his voice calm but firm. "David, we sent the hair we found in your dryer to the state crime lab for DNA analysis." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The DNA doesn't match Sarah Jenkins. It matches Emily Carter, a woman missing from Colorado for 2 years." David's eyes widened in disbelief. He vehemently denied knowing anyone named Emily Carter. "I've never been to Colorado," he insisted, his voice trembling slightly. "You've got the wrong guy. This is a mistake." Detective Miller leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "We have irrefutable DNA evidence linking you to a missing woman from another state, David." "Explain that." His initial denial quickly gave way to a stammering defense. He claimed that Emily must have stayed at his house sometime in the past, perhaps a friend of a friend. He couldn't remember, he said, it was so long ago. But the detectives weren't buying it. They pressed him harder, pointing out the inconsistencies in his story and the implausibility of his explanations. As the interrogation wore on, David's facade began to crumble. He became increasingly agitated, his denials less convincing. He fidgeted in his chair, avoided eye contact, and his voice cracked with emotion. Finally, he broke down, tears streaming down his face. Okay, he sobbed. I knew Emily. She stayed with me for a few weeks a long time ago. But I didn't hurt her. I swear. The detectives knew he was still lying, but they had him on the ropes. The DNA evidence had shattered his carefully constructed narrative, and the truth was slowly beginning to emerge. The game was up. He'd done it before, and now, he was about to face the consequences. 2 years earlier, in the picturesque town of Boulder, Colorado, Emily Carter vanished without a trace. Just like Sarah, Emily was a vibrant young woman with a bright future. She worked as a graphic designer and enjoyed hiking and spending time with her friends. Her disappearance baffled investigators, who initially suspected she might have gotten lost or injured while hiking. Emily's parents, devastated by her disappearance, never gave up hope. They plastered the town with flyers, organized search parties, and hired a private investigator, but all their efforts were in vain. The case eventually went cold, leaving Emily's family with unanswered questions and a lingering sense of grief. Now, with the discovery of Emily's DNA in David's dryer, the Colorado investigation was suddenly reopened. Detectives from Boulder PD contacted Sheriff Brody, and a joint investigation was launched. As they delved into Emily's past, striking parallels between her case and Sarah's began to emerge. Just like Sarah, Emily had a boyfriend who initially presented himself as cooperative and concerned. And just like Sarah, Emily had supposedly told friends she was feeling restless and needed a change. But most disturbingly, David was there. Records showed that David had lived in Boulder at the time of Emily's disappearance. He had even worked at a coffee shop near Emily's apartment. The detectives discovered that David had briefly dated Emily before she disappeared. He had been questioned at the time, but he had an alibi and there was no evidence linking him to her disappearance. Now, with the DNA evidence, everything had changed. The parallels were chilling, too similar to be a coincidence. The same man, the same pattern of behavior, 2 young women vanished without a trace. The evidence was mounting, and David's lies were quickly unraveling. He insisted both women ran away. But the truth was far more sinister. He'd done it before, and he was about to pay for his crimes. With David now the prime suspect in 2 missing persons cases spanning 2 states, the investigation escalated dramatically. Sheriff Brody obtained a warrant to thoroughly search David's property, including his house, garage, and the surrounding land. The search was meticulously conducted, with forensic experts combing every inch for any evidence that could link David to Sarah and Emily's disappearances. Inside David's house, they found little that was immediately incriminating. However, a closer examination of his financial records revealed some interesting details. There were several receipts for long-distance bus tickets to Colorado, purchased around the time of Emily's disappearance. David had claimed he had never been to Colorado, but the receipts proved otherwise. They also discovered travel records showing that David had taken several trips to Denver in the years leading up to Emily's disappearance. He had used cash to pay for these trips, making it difficult to track his movements. In his garage, they found a storage container filled with old maps and hiking guides for various trails in Colorado, including the one near where Emily's car had been found abandoned. The most damning piece of evidence was found buried in David's backyard. It was a small, silver locket with a picture of Emily inside. The locket had been reported missing by Emily's parents after her disappearance. Finding it on David's property was a clear indication of his involvement in her case. The circumstantial evidence linking David to both disappearances was mounting. The receipts, travel records, hiking guides, and the locket all pointed to his guilt. The detectives were confident that they had enough evidence to charge David with the kidnapping and murder of both Sarah Jenkins and Emily Carter. He insisted they ran away, but the evidence painted a much darker picture. He'd done it before, and now, his past was catching up to him. The families of Sarah and Emily deserved justice, and the detectives were determined to bring David to justice for his heinous crimes. The detectives consulted with a forensic psychologist, Dr. Eleanor Reynolds, a specialist in criminal behavior analysis. Dr. Reynolds explained the concept of signature behavior, which refers to the unique and consistent patterns that repeat offenders often exhibit in their crimes. These patterns are not necessary for the commission of the crime but rather fulfill a psychological need for the perpetrator. Dr. Reynolds reviewed the case files for both Sarah and Emily, and she immediately identified several striking similarities in the way they disappeared. Both women were young, attractive, and had been in relationships with David. In both cases, David claimed that the women had run away, leaving behind a note indicating their desire for a fresh start. In both cases, there was no clear crime scene, and the women's bodies were never found. Dr. Reynolds pointed out that the runaway narrative appeared to be David's signature. It allowed him to maintain a semblance of control over the situation and portray himself as a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator. The typed note, the absence of a struggle, and the suggestion that the women were unhappy all served to reinforce this narrative. She also highlighted the fact that David had carefully cultivated a persona of a kind and supportive boyfriend, making it difficult for others to suspect him of any wrongdoing. This facade allowed him to gain the trust of his victims and isolate them from their friends and family. The concept of signature behavior provided a crucial framework for understanding David's crimes. It demonstrated that Sarah and Emily's disappearances were not isolated incidents but rather part of a larger, more sinister pattern of behavior. He insisted they ran away, but Dr. Reynolds' analysis revealed a chilling consistency in his methods, solidifying the case against him and confirming that he'd done it before. This understanding provided further motivation to the detectives to bring him to justice, offering some solace to the grieving families of Sarah and Emily. As the investigation deepened, detectives turned their attention to David's past relationships. They interviewed former girlfriends and acquaintances, hoping to uncover any patterns of controlling or abusive behavior. What they found was disturbing. Several former girlfriends described David as charming and attentive at first, but gradually becoming more possessive and controlling. He would constantly check up on them, demand to know where they were and who they were with, and become jealous and angry if they spent time with other people. Some women reported that he had isolated them from their friends and family, making them feel dependent on him. One former girlfriend, named Lisa, recounted a particularly chilling incident. She said that David had become enraged when she told him she wanted to break up with him. He had locked her in his apartment and refused to let her leave, screaming at her for hours. She eventually managed to escape when he went to the store, but she was terrified and never spoke to him again. Detectives also discovered that David had been involved in a previous relationship that had ended mysteriously. His girlfriend at the time, a young woman named Jennifer, had disappeared without a trace several years ago. The case had been closed due to lack of evidence, but the detectives now wondered if David had been involved in her disappearance as well. Jennifer's friends and family described her as a happy and outgoing person who loved her life. They couldn't imagine her running away or disappearing voluntarily. They had always suspected that David had something to do with her disappearance, but they had never been able to prove it. The information uncovered about David's past painted a disturbing picture of a man with a history of controlling behavior and a potential for violence. It suggested that Sarah and Emily were not his first victims, and that he had been able to get away with his crimes for years. He insisted they ran away, but his past revealed a pattern of abuse and a potential link to another missing woman, making it clear that he'd done it before and was capable of anything. The detectives were more determined than ever to bring him to justice and prevent him from hurting anyone else. The mounting evidence against David was overwhelming. The DNA evidence linking him to Emily Carter, the circumstantial evidence connecting him to both Emily and Sarah's disappearances, and the revelations about his past relationships all pointed to his guilt. Sheriff Brody and the Boulder PD detectives agreed that they had enough to make an arrest. David was taken into custody and formally charged with 2 counts of kidnapping and 2 counts of first-degree murder. Although Sarah and Emily's bodies had not been found, the detectives believed that they were dead, based on the evidence and the circumstances of their disappearances. The lack of a body, however, presented a challenge for the prosecution. The charges sent shockwaves through both Harmony Creek and Boulder. The communities were horrified to learn that a seemingly ordinary man was suspected of committing such heinous crimes. Sarah and Emily's families were devastated by the news, but they were also relieved that progress was finally being made in the cases. They had waited so long for answers, and now it seemed that justice was finally within reach. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Michael Thompson, began preparing for trial. They knew that they had a strong circumstantial case, but they also knew that they would need to convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that David was guilty. They planned to present the DNA evidence, the travel records, the locket, and the testimony of David's former girlfriends. They also planned to call Dr. Reynolds to testify about the concept of signature behavior and how it applied to David's crimes. David pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Susan Miller, argued that the prosecution's case was based on speculation and conjecture. She claimed that there was no direct evidence linking David to Sarah and Emily's disappearances and that the circumstantial evidence was open to interpretation. She insisted that David was being wrongly accused and that the real killer was still out there. He insisted they ran away, but now he was fighting for his own freedom, facing the consequences of his actions and the weight of the evidence against him. The stage was set for a long and difficult trial. The arrest of David brought a mix of emotions to Sarah and Emily's families. There was relief that someone was finally being held accountable for their daughter's disappearances, but also renewed grief and pain. The thought of what Sarah and Emily might have endured in their final moments was unbearable. Sarah's parents, Carol and Tom, were heartbroken. They had always hoped that Sarah would be found safe and sound, but now they knew that she was likely gone forever. They struggled to cope with the loss of their daughter, but they found strength in their community and in their determination to seek justice for Sarah. They attended every court hearing, listened intently to the evidence, and offered support to Emily's family. Emily's parents, Susan and Robert, had endured years of uncertainty and unanswered questions. They had never given up hope of finding Emily, but as time went on, their hope dwindled. The discovery of Emily's DNA in David's dryer was a devastating blow, but it also provided them with a sense of closure. They finally knew what had happened to their daughter, and they were determined to see David brought to justice. Both families formed a close bond, united by their shared grief and their common goal of seeking justice for Sarah and Emily. They supported each other through the difficult days leading up to the trial, sharing memories of their daughters and offering words of comfort. They knew that the trial would be emotionally challenging, but they were prepared to face it together. They became advocates for missing persons, using their experiences to raise awareness and to push for legislation that would help prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future. They wanted to ensure that Sarah and Emily's stories would never be forgotten and that other families would not have to endure the same pain that they had suffered. He insisted they ran away, but the families knew the truth, and their fight for justice became a testament to the enduring love and resilience of the human spirit. The trial was their chance to finally give Sarah and Emily a voice, to tell their stories, and to hold David accountable for his actions. The trial of David began in the Harmony Creek Courthouse, a somber and tense atmosphere filling the room. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Thompson, presented a carefully constructed case built on three main pillars: DNA evidence, circumstantial evidence, and expert testimony on behavioral patterns. The DNA evidence was presented first. The lab technician who analyzed the hair testified about the process of DNA extraction and analysis, explaining how the DNA profile from the hair found in David's dryer matched that of Emily Carter. The prosecution argued that this evidence alone was enough to prove that David was connected to Emily's disappearance. Next, the prosecution presented the circumstantial evidence. They introduced the bus tickets to Colorado, the travel records, the hiking guides, and the locket with Emily's picture. They argued that this evidence, taken together, painted a clear picture of David's involvement in both Sarah and Emily's disappearances. They showed how David lied about never being in Colorado, and how the locket proved his direct connection to Emily. Finally, the prosecution called Dr. Eleanor Reynolds to testify about the concept of signature behavior. Dr. Reynolds explained how David's runaway narrative, his pattern of isolating his victims, and his carefully cultivated persona of a kind and supportive boyfriend all fit the profile of a serial offender. She argued that the similarities between Sarah and Emily's disappearances were too striking to be a coincidence. Throughout the trial, the prosecution emphasized the fact that David had consistently lied to the police and to the families of Sarah and Emily. He had insisted they ran away, but the evidence showed that he was the one responsible for their disappearances. The prosecution argued that David was a calculating and manipulative predator who had carefully planned and executed his crimes. The families of Sarah and Emily sat in the courtroom, listening intently to the evidence, their hearts filled with grief and their determination for justice unwavering. He insisted they ran away, but his lies were now being exposed for all to see, and the prosecution was determined to make him pay for his crimes. The weight of the evidence was heavy, but the defense was prepared to fight back. The defense, led by Susan Miller, mounted a vigorous defense, attacking the prosecution's case on every front. Their primary strategy was to cast doubt on the evidence and create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. Regarding the DNA evidence, the defense argued that the single blonde hair could have been transferred to David's dryer by accident. They suggested that Emily Carter may have stayed at David's house at some point, or that the hair could have been carried into the house on someone's clothing. They also questioned the integrity of the DNA analysis, suggesting that there was a possibility of contamination or error in the lab. As for the circumstantial evidence, the defense argued that it was open to interpretation and did not prove David's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They claimed that the bus tickets to Colorado were old and did not necessarily mean that David had traveled there at the time of Emily's disappearance. They also argued that the hiking guides and the locket could have been planted on David's property by someone who wanted to frame him. The defense also attacked Dr. Reynolds' testimony on signature behavior. They argued that the concept was subjective and unreliable, and that the similarities between Sarah and Emily's disappearances were not unique to David. They presented their own expert witness, a psychologist who testified that the runaway narrative was a common explanation for missing persons cases and did not necessarily indicate criminal behavior. The defense portrayed David as a kind and caring man who was being wrongly accused of a crime he did not commit. They emphasized the lack of direct evidence linking David to Sarah and Emily's disappearances and argued that the prosecution's case was based on speculation and conjecture. He insisted they ran away, and the defense tried to reinforce that narrative, painting a picture of a man unfairly accused, hoping to sway the jury's opinion and create enough doubt to acquit their client. Their goal was to dismantle the prosecution's case, piece by piece, and ultimately secure David's freedom. The emotional climax of the trial arrived with the testimonies of Sarah and Emily's family members. Carol and Tom Jenkins, Sarah's parents, took the stand first, their voices trembling with grief as they described their daughter's life, her love for teaching, and her vibrant personality. They recounted the devastating moment when they realized she was missing and the agonizing weeks that followed, filled with uncertainty and fear. They spoke of the pain of knowing that they would never see their daughter again and the emptiness that her absence had left in their lives. Susan and Robert Carter, Emily's parents, followed, their testimony equally heartbreaking. They described Emily as a kind and compassionate woman who had a bright future ahead of her. They spoke of their years-long search for Emily and the despair they felt when the case went cold. They recounted the moment when they learned that Emily's DNA had been found in David's dryer, a moment that brought both closure and renewed grief. The impact of their testimonies on the jury was palpable. Many jurors were visibly moved to tears, their faces etched with sorrow and sympathy. The family's words painted a vivid picture of Sarah and Emily as real people, not just names in a case file, and their grief served as a powerful reminder of the human cost of David's crimes. The prosecution also presented evidence of David's past controlling behavior. Lisa, one of David's former girlfriends, bravely testified about the time he held her captive in his apartment. Her testimony revealed a chilling pattern of abuse and control, further solidifying the prosecution's case. Throughout the trial, David remained impassive, showing little emotion. But the jury observed him closely, scrutinizing his every move and expression. They saw the pain and grief on the faces of Sarah and Emily's families, and they compared it to David's cold and detached demeanor. The evidence was compelling, but it was the emotional impact of the family's testimonies that truly resonated with the jury. He insisted they ran away, but the family's grief-stricken faces told a different story, a story of loss, pain, and the unwavering determination to find justice for their daughters. The jury knew they had a difficult decision to make, but they were determined to weigh the evidence carefully and reach a verdict that was fair and just. After weeks of intense testimony and emotional arguments, the case was finally handed over to the jury. The 12 jurors, their faces etched with the weight of their responsibility, filed into the deliberation room to begin their discussions. The deliberation process was long and arduous. The jurors carefully reviewed the evidence, re-examined the testimonies, and debated the merits of the prosecution and defense's arguments. Some jurors were initially convinced of David's guilt, while others were more hesitant, wanting to ensure that they had no reasonable doubt before reaching a verdict. The DNA evidence was a key point of discussion. Some jurors questioned whether the single blonde hair could have been transferred to David's dryer by accident, while others argued that the match to Emily Carter was too significant to ignore. The circumstantial evidence also sparked debate, with jurors weighing the significance of the bus tickets, travel records, and locket. The jurors also grappled with the lack of a body. The defense argued that without a body, there was no proof that Sarah and Emily were dead. The prosecution countered that the circumstances of their disappearances, combined with the other evidence, strongly suggested that they had been murdered. After days of deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom was filled with anticipation as the jurors filed back into their seats, their faces unreadable. The judge asked the foreperson to read the verdict. In the case of the state of Ohio versus David Miller, the foreperson announced, "On the charge of kidnapping Sarah Jenkins, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Sarah Jenkins, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of kidnapping Emily Carter, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder of Emily Carter, we find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Sarah and Emily's families wept with relief, their long fight for justice finally coming to an end. David sat motionless, his face betraying no emotion as the verdict was read. He insisted they ran away, but the jury saw through his lies, and found him guilty of taking their lives. Justice had finally been served. The sentencing phase of the trial was another emotionally charged event. Sarah and Emily's families were given the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements, allowing them to express the full extent of their grief and pain and to confront David directly. Carol Jenkins, Sarah's mother, spoke first, her voice filled with anger and sorrow. She described the devastating impact of Sarah's disappearance on her family and the community. She spoke of the dreams that Sarah would never fulfill and the milestones that she would never experience. She turned to David, her eyes blazing with fury, and told him that he had destroyed her life and that she would never forgive him for what he had done. Tom Jenkins, Sarah's father, followed, his voice choked with emotion. He spoke of the joy that Sarah had brought into their lives and the emptiness that her absence had left behind. He described the sleepless nights he had spent searching for her and the pain of knowing that he would never see her again. He told David that he was a monster and that he deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison. Susan and Robert Carter, Emily's parents, also delivered powerful victim impact statements. They spoke of their years-long search for Emily and the despair they felt when the case went cold. They described the moment when they learned that Emily's DNA had been found in David's dryer and the sense of closure that it brought. They told David that he had stolen their daughter's life and that he would never be able to atone for his crimes. After hearing the victim impact statements, the judge, Judge Thompson, addressed David directly. He spoke of the heinous nature of his crimes and the devastating impact that they had had on the families of Sarah and Emily. He stated that David had shown no remorse for his actions and that he posed a clear and present danger to society. Judge Thompson then sentenced David to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He stated that this sentence was the only way to ensure that David would never be able to harm another person again. He insisted they ran away, but the judge made sure he would never run free again. The families of Sarah and Emily wept with relief and gratitude as the sentence was handed down. They knew that no sentence could ever bring their daughters back, but they found some measure of peace in knowing that David would be held accountable for his crimes. In the aftermath of the trial, Sarah and Emily's families found a measure of peace. They knew that nothing could ever bring their daughters back, but they were grateful that justice had been served and that David would never be able to harm another person again. They continued to advocate for missing persons, sharing their stories and working to raise awareness about the importance of DNA evidence in solving cold cases. The case had a lasting impact on the communities of Harmony Creek and Boulder. People were shocked and saddened by the heinous nature of David's crimes, and they struggled to come to terms with the fact that someone they knew could be capable of such evil. The case also served as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the need to protect vulnerable members of society. Sheriff Brody and Detective Miller were commended for their tireless efforts in solving the case. They had never given up on Sarah and Emily, and their determination to find the truth had ultimately led to David's arrest and conviction. The case also highlighted the power of DNA evidence in solving cold cases. Without the single blonde hair found in David's dryer, Emily Carter's disappearance might have remained a mystery forever. The story of Sarah Jenkins and Emily Carter serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of deception and the importance of trusting one's instincts. It also highlights the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love and hope. He insisted they ran away, but his lies were ultimately exposed by the unwavering determination of law enforcement and the families who refused to give up on their loved ones. The single strand of hair, a seemingly insignificant detail, became the key to unlocking a dark secret and bringing a killer to justice, proving that even in the face of unimaginable loss, truth and justice can prevail. And though the pain of their absence would forever remain, Sarah and Emily's legacies lived on, reminding everyone of the importance of cherishing life and fighting for what is right.